slave ships that arrived in Charleston during that 100-year period. Overwhelming information. Let me give you one example of one of the ships on the chart if I can find it. A very tiny ship. Here it is. See, she's right. That's not even a halfway decent ship. Anyway, okay, here, this was taken off the chart. The name of the ship was Two Brothers. Captain's name was Hugh Glenn. He had been British. And that ship arrived in Charleston in the year 1771 from Senegambia, Africa. Okay. What happened to the 45 of the slaves? Died and thrown into the ocean. Absolutely terrible, terrible inner night week average journey across what was called the Middle Passage of the Atlantic Ocean. If you've ever seen diagrams of slave ships, the slaves are like stacked up horizontally and vertically, almost on top of one another. So you can imagine any sort of disease or illness on that boat. Bad news. Now, if you looked at the bottom of the chart I'm talking about in cabin 5, the overall numbers, about a 15% overall death rate. For those who did arrive alive in this area, they were typically quarantined. Sometimes they were put into land-based what we call pestilence or pest houses for short. Sullivan's Island, just a couple miles behind you guys here. The James Island, which is right next to downtown Charleston. As often as not, those slaves are actually impounded right out on their ships in the harbor for several weeks until it was determined they were healthy enough, quote unquote, healthy enough to be sold in downtown Charleston. So that's when representatives from all of your plantations would send their people into downtown Charleston to buy their slaves. And I hope you realize this. I think you do. Slaves were not considered to be human beings. Turn back in with chattel. Chattel is a fancy word for property. I mean, he enslaved or bought and sold his property, taxed as property, and unfortunately generally treated as property. Price of a slave. I use my example of Two Brothers. You guys were going into downtown Charleston in the 1770s to buy a slave. Any idea what the average price you paid back in that day? I'm using American dollars from back then. So I'm not using today's dollars. I'm not using English dollars. Any idea the price of a slave?
$400 for a
To a thousand.
$100.
400.
You see the price? You think that sounds high, low? Any idea? Most people their head goes sideways. So really, most people slaves were actually quite expensive then. In the 1770s, you would have actually paid about $5 US, say, in their field hand over experiences, but as much as $1,400. Depending upon age, the younger were generally more expensive than the older ones. They were supposed to live longer. Males were generally more expensive than females. You get a young, physically strong male who also has, let's say, one of those crafts or skills, you'd have been at the top of the chart. One other example, young slave girl, 12 years old, maybe turning 13, one of your more expensive slaves. Why? Babies. Every baby born immediately enslaved, and that's how your owners would obviously increase their slavery. So a young slave girl, one of your most expensive as well. So let's just say the average in the time frame I'm talking about was about $700 US a slave. What does that translate into 2026 money? Well, if you use like your smart inflation indicator, that is a bit over $38,000 per slave. So really, the initial cost quite a bit. Now, most of the boot house slaves were those Central Western Africans I've been talking about. Like I say, purchased in downtown Charleston, which is south of here to your left, about 9 miles. Once you buy them, then what? There were no roads or bridges from downtown Charleston up to this plantation or this area till the end of the 1800s, well after slavery was over. So prior to that, everyone had to be loaded on flatboats downtown, and then you navigate the rivers and tidal creeks to bring everyone up. So transportation was obviously a real factor back in the day. Well, cotton was king throughout the South during slave years. It was here. At one point in time, Boone Hall had about 1,100 acres planted in cotton. So when the slaves weren't doing cotton work out here, spring, summer, and fall, that's when they were making these bricks. The bricks you do see on their housing, on the walls, certainly other brick structures. Now, a brick requires you to mix together 3 simple ingredients. What are those ingredients? Clay, water, water and, well, no, dirt is the clay. What do we have our feet on here? Sand. Some parts of the world straw, but here it's clay, sand, and water. Straight ahead of you here, past the tree line, is our main waterway. It's called the Wampanoag Tidal Creek. That's the Indian name, chock full of clay, sand, and water, which is why Boone Hall was on a list of 40 plantations end of the 1700s into the 1800s that made bricks because of the dominance of those three materials. Briefly, what would a week look like for the enslaved blood here? Expected to work certainly Monday through Saturdays, pretty much dawn to dusk, whatever task, whatever job would be assigned each. In the production field, well off to your right to the north here, in the plantation house, doing the various servant duties. Maybe you were taking care of the slave babies or the very youngest of the slave children, but 6 long days working for the owner. Day 7 was a Sunday like today. And on Sundays, most of the slaves did have the day off. They needed a skeleton crew in the house, but everyone else had off. A chance to catch up on some rest, obviously. Visit at greater length with other slaves on the plantation, certainly never off the plantation. Maybe group worship. Now, cabin 1 here, off to your right, is set up as house of praise, house of worship. If you get a chance later, there's a little pedestal with a red button inside, and it does give you a 5-minute audio about the early spiritual life of the slaves. So, very, very interesting. But for sure on Sunday, what I call domestic duties: sewing, laundry, extra cooking for their households, small little garden plots that they apparently were allowed to have back in those days. And that whole system of slavery finally came to an end at the end of the American Civil War, 1865. But it also took the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, making it illegal. So it was a combination of the war ending and the 13th Amendment. Well, Boone Hall had hit its high of just under 300 slaves, I mentioned, probably about 15 years or so before the Civil War began. So when the war ended and slavery ended, there was still about 260 living out here. All of a sudden, ex-slaves, freed individuals. Now, do you picture all 260 of them just kind of walking away? Probably not. We understand the best documents we have indicate roughly half of the 260 chose to leave here individually. A number of them would have gone off left towards Florida, safer territory. Ahead of you here is to the west. That was kind of uncharted territory. Very, very few would have attempted to go that way. But off to your right is north. And if you think, the vast majority went north. When you think about it, a safer, smarter decision would be to head north, where the free states were and where Canada certainly is. So the vast majority went that way. But about half stayed at Boone Hall. To do what?
Sharecropping.
Well, sharecrop, but I call actually tenant farmers, basic farming. Most of them have been the basic farmers who have been out here for generation after generation, likely never have to step foot on this plantation. So the thought of leaving here for many would have obviously been scary. Now, conditions right after the war by Germans were not in much of a position to pay. It took a good 2 to 3 decades for work conditions to get better out here. Eventually, some sharecropping opportunities towards the end of the 1800s. This also, towards the end of the century, became a big pecan plantation. Then the German owners were in a much, much better position to pay weekly in American dollars for the amount of work that was being done. But that took a very, very long time. These cabins, these remaining brick houses out front here, were used all the way up until 1940 to house farmer families. So very, very long use for the housing. Just a half a minute to go. The wooden ones. I mentioned we had 18, maybe 20 smaller wooden ones where the field slave lived. Behind the house to the north, unfortunately, no remnants of those. Either torn down or burned down after the Civil War. Now, we know they existed. We do have photographic evidence from the later 1800s just showing us how simple and small the Boone Hall wooden slave houses were. But what's up front here? So well designed and engineered by the British of the day. Boones, these were built during near the tail end of the Boone ownership. So well built by the slaves of the day, these houses still standing. So these are all about 210, 215 years old apiece. Each is on the National Register of Historic Sites. So very, very. As It's been a pleasure talking to you. Enjoy doing the gullah.
Thank you.
If you have questions, I'm around certainly to answer. Thank you, guys. Yeah. Thank you. Yep, 3:15. I would highly recommend the gullah.
Sunday.